So a few broad concepts that I think make sense for us to start out. And again, this is an animal science class. We focus on reproductive behavior. And the species that we're interested in typically fall into a mating system known as promiscuity. And I'm going to talk about the various mating systems on Thursday. But suffice it to say for today, for the most part, what this means is that any male will mate with any female. And there's no pair bonds that form between the individuals. So in other words, it's just about mating and then moving on. And as it turns out, for most of the species that we work with, one male can mate with many, many females during the course of a breeding season. And so that sets up some predictable sorts of characteristics about their behavior, about their social systems, that one can draw inferences from by understanding the kinds of selective pressures that are operating on these animals, or that have operated on these animals for many thousands of years. And then for the species of our interest, because we're going to talk about animals that have been domesticated, some of the selective pressures have changed because of the influence of humans, and we'll talk about some of those changes as we proceed. So an important idea here is the notion that most of our species of interest are either promiscuous, as I said, any male with any female, no pair bonds, or in some cases polygynous. Again, we'll talk about that on Thursday. Typically one male who will mate with many females. In some cases there are some pair bonds formed, harems if you will. And so because of this nature, typically one male able to breed many females. In domestication, in production systems, few males are really needed in order to propagate the species, in order to develop a production system. And that reduction in the number of males that are contributing to the genetics of the next generations brings about some rather dramatic changes that we'll talk about as we proceed. A few important concepts here that I want to distinguish. So I'm sure you've all heard the term libido. Okay, and you think of that sex drive, you know. So what does that really mean? It doesn't mean, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean how often you have sex, because most of the time you don't have sex every time you're thinking about sex. But you're probably thinking about sex a fair amount. Some more than others, some less than others. But libido is about this mental state, this sort of cognitive state where you're thinking, boy, wouldn't it be nice to have sex now and whenever. And you think about it and how we measure libido. In humans, we don't ask how often you have sex. We might ask how often you think about sex. And so, you know, with an age group typically of present in this room, with the exception of the person in the front, you probably think about it every few minutes. Maybe some of you every few seconds. But probably not much broader out than that. As you get a little older, then it's, you know, maybe only a little bit less often. But it's about this cognitive state. It's about thinking about sex, desiring sex, not about having sex. Now in animals, how do we get at this idea of what their mental state is? Are animals thinking about sex? We don't know what animals think about. We can't know what they think about. We can make some guesses based on what their behavior is. And so with animals, rather than talking about libido, and you will see in the literature some people use the term libido with respect to animals, but I think it's a really imprecise term. Because in animals, what we really do is we measure their behavior. And so what we look at there, in contrast to the motivation, the cognitive state, the sexual interest, we look at their mating competence. When given the opportunity to mate, do they do so? And if given lots of opportunity to mate, do they do it a lot? Okay, and so it turns out to be a fairly important thing for us to look at, as I'll show you in a few moments. So I want you to distinguish this idea of the mental state, libido, and then the actual physical behavior of mating competence. Now one can imagine a state in animals where if they have a very high mating competence and they mate very often, you might assume, well, if we want to ascribe the term libido, maybe we would say that animal has a high libido. But if they don't have a high mating competence, we don't know why, whether that's because of some mental state, where they're not driven or motivated to have sex, or is it because there's something physical happening with that animal that makes it difficult for them to have sex. And so when we measure their performance, how often they have sex, maybe that number is low because there are other things influencing their expression of behavior. So what we try to understand in behavior is what animals do. Sometimes we try to understand what are the circumstances and the environment in which they do these things. We try to understand the physiological basis that allows them or permits them to do certain things. We try to understand the function of some of the behaviors they do, but it becomes very difficult when we try to guess at sort of the mental state of what we're doing. And so we can talk a lot and learn a lot about behavior without necessarily worrying too much about mental state. But it's an important distinction that I think is worthy of consideration. Finally, I just want to very briefly mention that when we're talking about behavior and competence and libido, we're not talking about fertility at all. Fertility has a much simpler, more narrowly defined definition, and that's really about the ability of the animal's sperm to inseminate, not just to inseminate, but to bring about conception when it joins with an oocyte. Okay, so we're not going to be looking at fertility at all. It's very different than either mating competence or libido. This is about the ability of that sperm to fertilize an egg. So that's for another lecture. So, because I like to look at behavior from an evolutionary perspective, because it is a product of evolution, there's some interesting observations that we can make when we especially compare animals in the wild, non-domesticated species, with animals that have been domesticated. And so you can look at an animal's behavior and think about it in a few different ways. And I like to use the term qualitative variation versus quantitative variation. So what do I mean by this? Qualitative, you know what variation means, that a behavior, that there's a range of some metric of a behavior. In the case of qualitative variation, we're talking about, where I'm referring to the sort of range in the appearance of the behavior. What does it look like? Does it vary among individuals within a species? Does it vary? Obviously it varies between species. But within a species, do we see a lot of range? Do we see a lot of variation in what sex looks like? Not a whole lot. You know, a bull does it the way a bull does it. And a ram does it the way a ram does it, and a dog does it the way a dog does it. And it's pretty much narrow range of qualitative. So by qualitative, I'm talking about the physical the motor patterns that their body employs in order to get the mating accomplished. Okay, so that's the sort of quality, not quality in the sense of good or bad, but quality in the sense of what it looks like. That's distinguished from an idea that I term quantitative variation. And here maybe you get that the word quantitative is a little bit more descriptive in some ways, I think, because it's sort of a number. How often? How frequent? What's the willingness and if you will, the outcome of the drive of this animal to accomplish mating? And as it turns out, that when we look at domesticated any species really, we see that there's little qualitative variation, very little. But in the quantitative variation, as it turns out, especially for domesticated species, we see quite a range. We see animals that are really breaking down the fences to get at females, and we see animals that would show little interest whatsoever in females. And maybe will mate when you give them the opportunity. If you give them enough time, they might get around to it. Well, why does this quantitative variation exist in domesticated species? Just thinking about the way evolution works, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for an animal to not be driven to reproduce. So what's going on here that makes this quantitative variation appear in domesticated species? And what we think is going on here is humans have stepped into the game and interfered with the selective process. We've come in and said, you know what? We're going to choose a male, and we're going to put that male with a bunch of females, and we're going to give him all the time that he needs to get the breeding done. And maybe eventually he gets the breeding done, maybe he doesn't, but perhaps because of some trait, some other trait that he possesses, he grows fast, his offspring grow fast, or maybe his daughters produce lots of milk, we still will choose that animal to be the sire of our herd. And there's no competition among the males in this case. So in a sense, what these single sire breeding operations has done is relaxed the selective pressure for sexual performance. So in nature, selection is intense. Males are fighting with each other. They're trying to gain access to females. And those males who don't try to gain access to females are not likely to leave very many offspring. And so you might expect then that whatever traits they're carrying are less likely to be reproduced in the next generation. On the other hand, those guys that are fighting one another or doing whatever it takes to gain access to the females are more likely to leave more offspring. Therefore, their traits are likely to be carried into the next generation. So we've kind of messed the system up a little bit by interfering with this breeding pattern. Make sense? Good. So let's look at what are the selective pressures on these animals. Now, normally in nature, there's a form of natural selection that's referred to as sexual selection. Okay, and this is where the competition, especially in what's known as intrasexual selection, where the competition among males is fierce. And here's some pictures of moose fighting it out. You know, perhaps they're fighting out over access to females in estrus and bison and elk, and even, well, this is play behavior in some young animals, but it gets at the idea of what the fighting, aggressive behavior among the males looks like in this species, where they rear up and bang their heads together. This is combat. This is battle for access to something. And what's of value to these animals where they have this combat typically is access to the female. So in nature, you have all this fighting, all this competition, and often the victor of the battle now wins the rights, if you will, to gain access to the female, chases the other males off, so now the females are his. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification of what actually happens in nature, because while these guys might be very successful, they often kind of do damage to one another. All this fighting causes injury, death. It's pretty dramatic. There's another strategy that can be a very effective strategy. It's politely called the sneaky copulator strategy. But when it was first described by a person studying bighorn sheep, Dr. Clutton-Brock, he referred to them, and may I use the F word because it's purely for scientific reasons. He published and he wrote the sneaky fucker strategy. So it works like this. These guys are fully preoccupied in battling each other to gain access to the female. Meantime, another guy, maybe smaller, not quite so obvious of a dominant male, sneaks in and mates as many females as he can until he's caught by these big guys, and then he runs off. He may not get as many females bred as these guys, but when you look at it on a population basis, these guys who are the sneaky, now I'm going to say copulators, these sneaky copulators might be getting as many females bred as the big dominant males. Yes?
But why would the females want to mate with a less dominant male?
So the question is, why would the females want, quote, whatever want means, allow a male who's maybe less dominant mate with her? Typically for these species where there's promiscuity or polygyny and one male with many females, the males are huge. Because of this, selection's operating on these males to get big and muscular and powerful, and so they're so much bigger than the females that they force their way. Females often, for these species, have no choice. Males are able to do this. You can anthropomorphize that into thinking, well, is it rape? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, in a way, you could say that it is, but that's a whole nother conversation. In either strategy, whether you're a big dominant male fighting other dominant males or the sneaky copulator, you're driven to get the mating done. Okay, and so your offspring, whether they turn out to be one of these guys or one of the sneakers, is driven to get the mating done. So in nature, this competition among the males, whatever form the competition takes, leads to a population of males that I like to call studs. That's that, you know what it means. What happened? Yes?
So if the alpha male dies, is it just the second in line gets that position, or does he have to fight with the other males that are there?
The question was, so you have an alpha male, and let's assume for the second the alpha male gets most of the breeding done. Now he dies or becomes weaker, gets older. This happens all the time. The next one in line is like ready. And in fact, often what happens before an alpha even dies, as the animal gets older, it's displaced by a younger, stronger animal that comes forward. So yes, it's like for many of these species, there's a hierarchy. You got your first one, then your second one, and they move up. But when the order is disrupted by some leaving or some coming in, there's a lot of sort of repositioning for status. So a lot of times in these stable groups, you have a pretty stable social order. And what all the big dominant male has to do is kind of look at another one, and they steer clear. It's sort of a nice adaptation in a way, you think about it, because it prevents the constant battles among the males. So there's challenges, but the challenges aren't happening constantly because it just doesn't, the end product of evolution would suggest that that's not a particularly good strategy to be constantly fighting. So there's stability typically in the group, but when the group disrupts, loss or gain of animals, the stability is shaken up for a while. But again, remember, you don't have to be the alpha to get all the breeding done. You just have to try, one way or another. Now, what happens when we get into?
Oh.
Yes.
What are studs again?
I'm sorry?
What are studs again?
Oh, so the studs, in other words, these are males with a high sex drive. These are males that are going to, that live to mate. You're welcome. Now, so here's sort of the natural setting. What happens in the captive, in the domesticated setting, is we've instituted this program where the male doesn't have to compete. We pick this male, you look good, I like the way your shape is, and you seem pretty healthy and whatnot, and so I don't know anything about your sex drive or your mating competence, but I want you to be the father of the sire of the next generation. So I take you and I put you in a pen and I put a whole bunch of females in there, and then I go away and I come back months later or whenever later when I think the end of the breeding season is, and I kind of expect and hope that all the females are going to get bred, and sometimes they do, but as it turns out, sometimes they don't, because there's still this variation present, genetic variation. I'll prove to you in a few moments that in fact this difference in this sex drive, mating competence, in fact has a genetic basis to it. Because evolution wouldn't work on this trait if there weren't some genetic basis to it. That's the whole idea. That's why evolution works, right? Because you have genetic variation, and then you have differential reproduction of those that have particular suites of genotypes and phenotypes. So now what we've done is we've created this setting. Here's the buck, and he's got a bunch of females, and he doesn't have to fight off any other bucks, and he can mate whenever he wants. And as it turns out, when you remove that competition and you allow, what this does is it allows some males who in nature might not take the opportunity to breed. I like eating, I think I'll just graze all day long and sleep and then graze the next day and not pay any attention to the females whatsoever. Well, you wouldn't expect that sort of animal to produce very many offspring in the wild, but when we suddenly give him a pen of females and there's no competition, he's going to be able to produce offspring as well. So this interference by humans, that is, we allow some animals to mate who might not be successful in the wild, takes place. The variation in this trait, this quantitative measure of sexual behavior, increases. You've got still have some high-performing males, but you're going to end up with some low-performing males too. And so one of the possible outcomes of this relaxation of natural selection is duds. In other words, males who don't mate when given the opportunity. And in fact, we know this is happening because we've done measures across the country across the world of the variation that exists in domesticated species, and we see this variation in our domesticated species that we don't see out in nature in the wild. So this is a pretty reasonable explanation as to where this variation arose. So I told you, now I'll prove to you that in fact there's a genetic basis to this variation. This study was done years ago, and it was done with chickens, and it was kind of a nice project. The nice thing about using chickens is they grow fast, they reach reproductive age quickly, so you can do an experiment on many generations in a reasonable period of time. This was a PhD project for a student, and you can imagine that somebody trying to get their PhD doesn't want to choose an animal species that has a 6 or 7 year generation interval, right? They'll never get their degree. But chickens reproduce a little faster. So what they did is they started with a big flock of young birds, and they took these males and they gave males an opportunity to mate with females. So they put a male in with a bunch of females, and they started the clock, and they counted how often the animals mated. Okay, so everybody got a score. Everybody got measured. Everybody got a score. And they calculated an average among the males, and not surprisingly, they see this nice bell-shaped curve. Some, which way is high for you guys here? Some real high, some low, a bunch in the middle. And what they did is they picked the guys who were at the high end of the curve, they picked guys who were at the low end of the curve, then they picked guys who were at the middle end of the curve, and then they put them in pens, and they let them mate. And then the next generation, they did the same thing. And they picked the high, and then they picked the low, and the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. This is sort of speeding up how natural selection might operate. And in fact, if we look at what happened after 20 generations now, here is the selection line, high, control, and low. And then let's just look at this last column, completed matings. Okay, so let's start with the control. This is where no selection was done. This is just sort of the random observation. No change really before or after the study had begun. So in other words, in this, I think it was about a 20-minute test period, but I'm not certain. They had 5 completed matings. Okay, but now 20 generations of selection for the high line, they've quintupled the performance. And for those guys who were selected at the low end, they're so sluggish in getting the mating done that most of the birds in the study didn't even mate in that 20-minute period, which is why the average is below 1 here. So you can see all the animals were on the same diet, housed in the same places. The environment was held as constant as is practically possible. The only thing that was different was at a young age, they were tested for their willingness, ability to get the mating done, and then assigned one or the other of these groups and then allowed to mate. So intense selection for mating behavior, no environmental perturbations, and you can see a very strong genetic basis to this mating behavior. Now, not too many studies have been done exactly like this in other species because of the time that it takes to do that. But there have been a number of studies that have looked across a wide range of species and experiments at the variation that exists in sexual behavior. And there are approximations of the heritability of this trait. Now, if you've had genetics, you know a little bit about what heritability means. In a general sense, you can think of, well, what's the likelihood that the trait will pass from one generation to the next. Heritability, quantitatively, heritability is a way of describing how much of the variation of that trait can be explained by the genetics. Interestingly, the heritability of mating competence, mating and sexual performance is about 0.5. That means that's 50%. 50% of the variation explained by genetics. That's a huge genetic influence. That's as high as some of the traits like growth rate. I mean, it's not exactly like hair color, which is a much more simplistic kind of genetics, but for a trait as complex as behavior, to see a heritability like 50% suggests that there's a strong genetic basis. So that's further support for this idea that, one, sexual selection is operating in the wild on maintaining this high sex drive in the animals, and two, that you can see how you would start to get to this increase in variation start to crop up once you stopped selecting. Once nature no longer played a role in who got the breeding done, but rather humans played a role in who did the breeding, now all of a sudden variation gets quite high. Turns out to have some real consequences in production systems, as I'll show you some data in a little bit. So it's interesting, but it also has some real production and economic consequences in livestock production. Now, I don't want you to think that just because genetics plays a role in the expression of sexual behaviors that an animal's experience and environment, social surroundings, etc., don't also play a role. So I'm just going to describe a couple studies to you that were done that shows that, in fact, the early rearing experience, what was life like as a youngster, would have on the later expression of sexual behavior in animals. So there's 3 studies that I'm going to describe, or actually each of these, multiple studies in each of these ideas. These are sort of conclusions from a number of different studies. And I start with the one that was done with pigs. So those of you, most of you should know, a boar is a male pig. What this particular study did was it took these young boars at birth, and they were hand-raised, hand-fed, and they were raised in isolation. So they didn't have an opportunity to interact with mom. They didn't have an opportunity to interact with other little piglets. Okay, and they're raised up nice and healthy, and then when they reached puberty, they were given the opportunity to mate with females when they were presented with females. Now that was a pretty severe social isolation, to not let them play with other piglets. And what that severe social isolation produced were boars that, when presented with females in estrus, would not mate those females. No interest in the females in estrus, and that effect of that early social deprivation became a permanent debilitation on these animals. In other words, they never really recovered from that social isolation effects on their performance. As I said, that was pretty profound social manipulation of their early development, right? You don't get to interact with another pig. So you could see that maybe there were a lot of things about these animals that changed. So another group did a series of studies using sheep. In this case, we used the sheep, and the isolation was not so severe. They weren't socially isolated. They were just raised without the presence of females. So what was done, rams were taken from their mothers, and they were placed in groups with just other rams and no females around. And they lived their happy little life until they reached puberty, and then their sexual performance was measured. And as a control or a treatment for that, there were other groups of rams who were raised mostly with just other rams, but periodically, throughout their young life, a female was placed into the group with them. And these were prepubertal, young ram lambs, okay? So not particularly sexually active, but they had an opportunity to be exposed to females on some sort of regular interval during the period, these months when they were growing up. And those females were in estrus when they were placed in there. So, and I forget the frequency. Periodically, a female in estrus put in the group, she was allowed to stay in there for a day or so, and then she was taken out. And then a week or so later, another female in estrus was put in, taken out. So these males, they spent most of their lives just with other males, but then periodically exposed to females. And what was found was that if you were raised without any females present, later in life, when you were given the opportunity to mate with females, you didn't. You hung out with your boyfriends, your ram lamb friends, okay? And when a female that was in estrus was placed in there with them, you showed a little bit of like fear, coupled with some disinterest. And we thought, wow, I wonder if this is permanent. So we should keep testing these guys and see if it lasts. And as it turns out, it didn't turn out to be permanent. So it had this short-term effect. So didn't understand what a female was, I suppose. So test them and test them and test them. And eventually, they started to mate. And over time, their mating performance picked up and reached about the same level as you found for the males who, by the way, when they had that exposure to females, the first time they were put in a pen where there was a female in estrus, now when they were sexually mature, they mated without any problem. And they mated at a frequency that was similar to males who were otherwise raised, in sort of unregulated, sort of mixed groups of males and females. So that early rearing experience and opportunity to interact with a member of the other gender played an important developmental role, But it didn't lock them out of this developmental trajectory as severely as what happened with the pigs. So we thought at the time, okay, well, we know a little bit about pigs and that severe isolation and its long-term effects. We know a little bit about the sheep and its effects, but it's not its lifelong effects on the animals. And we had a big feedlot and we had access to lots of cattle. So we said, well, let's see what happens when we do this with bulls. So we designed the study with bulls identically to the way we designed the study with sheep. And in fact, we took these bulls that had never been around any females and we placed them in the pen with females and estrus, and the very first time they went and they mated. Almost as if we had not manipulated their early environment. So something about the developmental trajectory in the bull was a little bit different than the sheep. They could overcome that lack of exposure or experience with females early in life. Except for one interesting observation we noticed, which was kind of funny. When we placed the bulls in with the females for the first time, they mounted right away. But they didn't care which way they mounted. They mounted head first, they mounted sideways, they would mount. But when they mounted in the typical appropriate orientation, behind the female, and the penis found the vagina, and they ejaculated, they thereafter always mounted in the appropriate orientation. So even though the behavior was it didn't require any learning for them to come in and start mounting, and they knew, that females were mountable, I suppose. But in a way, they had to learn the orientation. They had to learn the right way to mount. I always thought that was interesting, about this mounting. And so if you watch bulls play, it's a very interesting thing to see because they fight a lot, but they also mount each other. And they mount each other quite a bit. And one of the things that I noticed when they mount each other is the orientation that a bull mounts another bull makes a huge difference in how long they're able to stay on top and what they're able to do. So let me describe what happens here. So let's say there's two bulls coming along here, and let's say I'm one of the bulls, and there's another one also facing that way, right? And I come up, and I jump on top, right? And I try to get my front legs clasped around him, and the video's running, so maybe I shouldn't do it, and I'm thrusting away. Nothing's really coming of it because there's nowhere to go. Meantime, now I'm the bull behind there, right? What can I do? I got my hind legs behind me, and this guy's pestering me. I pull away, I turn around, and now we start to fight. And that's all good, Now let me describe what happens if I'm a bull and I'm mounting the bull, and now the bull's looking at me. Okay, and he comes up, and now I mount him this way. Now my power is behind me. Now I'm the one behind there. And I'm like, I can't get away. I'm trying to get away. And while I'm trying to get away, I'm doing this with my head. And where is my head? What is my head hitting? A very sensitive copulatory organ. So there's all this penis massage taking place when these boys are mounting each other. So from a very early, I'm going to show you at the end of the lecture these pictures of calves mounting each other, and you'll see they mount from all sorts of orientations. There was a very famous behavioral endocrinologist. His name was Frank Beach. He's considered the father of behavioral endocrinology, award-winning, published hundreds of papers, really established the field. If you go on to study in this area, you'll read many of his papers. His paper, even though he studied years ago, his papers are still cited. He came to my PhD defense, and I was talking about some of this research. And he said to me, and I wasn't Dr. Katz, he said to me, and Larry, I wasn't Dr. Katz yet. He said to me, so Larry, you know what you've proved? I said, tell me, Dr. Beach. If it feels good, do it. That's what happens in this developmental trajectory. These bulls they're getting sensory feedback from the reproductive organs that says, this is a reward. You can reward animals with a lot of different positive kinds of ways. You can give them food treats, or you can give them sexual gratifying stimulus, which is what mounting does for these animals. And so the point of this is that if you think about development, so from the time, and let's say postnatal development, from the time you're born until the time you die, your behavior is constantly changing. You're evaluating what's going on in the environment, you're reacting to that environment, whether it's the physical environment, the social environment, and things are going to change. They're going to be influenced by that environment. There are certain behaviors that you're going to do, that you're more likely to do, and you're going to do in high frequency. And they might not require a whole lot of experience and learning and training for you to be able to do that. We sometimes think of that as, quote, instinctive behavior. You know, it occurs without any real learning, so you could use that term, but it's kind of an antiquated term. I like to think of this developmental trajectory as being sort of easily released, like there are some behaviors that are just going to appear, like sexual play and mounting, but that there are refinements that happen during this development that are influenced by experience. And so, depending upon your species, your evolution, and the history and your individual history, there are all these impacts on this this track. Development is going to proceed, and it's going to proceed in a particular way, but it may be influenced by the kinds of things that are impinging on your nervous system. So you're constantly weighing what's happening in the environment, learning what's happening in the environment, but there's some suite of behaviors that are just likely to happen whether you've had any experience or not. And why this difference, you know, in the sheep from the cattle, hard to know. It's a good question for research, why the impacts were so much longer on these animals. But we have some hints as to what some of these influences are. So I'm going to tell you about some other studies that we did that get at that. But I also want to get at this, this notion of how the social environment can influence the expression of some of these behaviors. And so sometimes we'll refer to this idea as facilitation of sexual performance. The social environment can inhibit or facilitate sexual performance. And this becomes important for us, especially in a huge industry like the dairy artificial insemination industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in this country. It explains why milk is so plentiful. It explains why cows produce so much milk they do now because of that intense selection on males. There are so few males used in breeding because we can collect semen, and one ejaculate from a male can be used to inseminate thousands of females. So you have intense selection on these males. These males become they're very valuable, they're very large, because they're cared for by people, they're handled by people, they're fed by people. These animals think they are part of your social group. And the way animals within a social group interact and develop, you asked about the social organization and the alpha male earlier, for example. Well, the bull's going to try to become an alpha male over me. Who's going to win? Not me. Not unless I'm smarter. I am. That means we have to be careful when we're working with these animals to not get killed. Before artificial insemination was put in wide practice in like the 1940s, 1950s, the number one cause of death on farms was the breeding bull. Not that people say they were aggressive. Well, maybe they're aggressive, but just think about how they play. I'm going to play, and I'm a bull. How do I do that? I take my head, and I hit it up against another, and I push them around, and I bang around, and maybe I have horns, and that assists it. I might get under it and flip it back. I've been flipped by a bull. I was in a pen, and I had tried to climb into the pen, and the bull put his head under my shoe, and then he just lifted his head up. And I looked like a trapeze artist, except I wasn't graceful. And my screaming was four-letter words as I flew across the pen. Incredibly powerful animals. And so play with a bull means death for a person, which means we want to design, we need to get this valuable semen out of the animal, and we need to do it in such a way that's efficient. The whole point of this was saying, you know, we need to work with these animals carefully and efficiently and understand how to harvest large numbers of viable sperm, because then we're talking about the interest in fertility and getting lots of females bred. So what we've learned over the years is a lot about how to sexually excite bulls. So that when we collect that semen, because what we know is the more aroused the animal is, the more sperm is deposited into that ejaculate. And we understand the physiology of that, the excitement that induces smooth muscle contraction that pulls more sperm from the epididymis into the ejaculatory ducts. So it's just, you know, quote, simple idea, but how do you get that animal to that state of that high arousal without putting yourself in a situation where you get killed by the animal because it's just in this frenzy? And so there's been a lot of work and research over the years in understanding something about how to collect semen. So we know, for example, that one of the things that you can do is you bring an animal into I'm going to show you a video in a moment of semen collection in a bull. And we bring these animals into this pen, and they know, first of all, they've been trained, so they know, I'm coming into the place where I'm going to ejaculate. So you have a pretty cooperative animal to begin with on your hands. But to be perfectly honest, they're in there several days a week, a couple ejaculations per day, and over a period of time, it's it's starting to get boring. So you have to find a way to keep it interesting for these animals, to keep them aroused. So what they'll do is they'll bring them in and they'll kind of show them another animal. It's like, ooh, don't you look good, don't you look good? And then all of a sudden, they'll take them over to another. And it's like, holy cow, that's crazy. And so that's this idea of changing the stimulus. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you in anything. You can get this arousal stimulated in the animals and to get them ejaculate larger numbers of sperm by just changing the stimulus a little bit. Or you change the location. You bring them in and you start to get them worked up over here, and then right before you think you're ready to collect them, you just move them over here. And that movement of sometimes just a few feet is enough to trigger this animal's excitement so that you get this facilitation of the harvest of a lot of sperm. On the other hand, there's some things we know that you don't want to take place. Like, if you're not the dominant animal in the group and the dominant animal is around, you're going to be inhibited a little bit. Picture what it looks like when a male is mounting. You are about as vulnerable as you're ever going to be because your soft underside's exposed. So now you're on top and the dominant animal is coming towards you with that look of like, I'm going to get you off that female, and he's going to come in with his head and he's going to ram you by the side, and if he's got horns, he's going to gore you and you're going to lie on the ground and bleed to death. Not that the animal thinks about it that way, but you see a threatening dominant animal. Do you think that's conducive to like sexual arousal? No, it's the complete opposite of that sexual arousal. In fact, we know that the hormones released associated with that stress do exactly the opposite in terms of the smooth muscle contractions of the reproductive tract, because they're shunting all the resources to your muscles to like get the hell out of town, right? Run away, fight or flight. So that isn't the situation you want to set up when you're trying to collect semen from these animals and get them to be sexually aroused. So this is a video of Mandinga, very famous Holstein bull, the first U.S. bull in which they collected enough semen over time to actually create 1 million straws. A straw represents one breeding unit. So he's like our first million semen producer. I'm going to show you this a couple times because there's a few things for you to see in here. So before I get it started, first I want you to note that there's a testing arena here. This is called the mount. It's another bull, a retired breeder who they no longer use his semen, but he's nice and big and he's strong, and he doesn't care. He'll mount anything, male or female. And so, in fact, you're better off when you're collecting your semen to have an animal that they mount that does not have a vagina. So then you don't lose your ejaculate. Okay. So you have this mount. This is Mandingo, who we're going to collect the semen from. And in the background, you're going to see there's some other animals. That turns out to be very, very important, because these animals, you can think of it as in baseball, you call it the bullpen. The pitchers who might be coming up next. Well, this is truly the bullpen, and these are the bulls who are going to be coming up next, and they're being sexually aroused by seeing what is going on in here. And I'm going to show you some data that proves that these animals pay attention to what's going on, and they become aroused by seeing what's going on with the other animals in the group, and it makes good selective sense. So you'll notice the background, and then we'll see this is essentially what happens. So a little prodding. It's like, okay, time to go to work. And he's going to mount. This is what's known, they call this in the industry a false mount. In other words, it's a mount without an ejaculation. The handler sort of pulls the penis aside so it doesn't get injured or dirty. Now he's got the artificial vagina, and that's it. Okay, so that's how the semen is collected. So what was shown over the years was that if you allow that male to mount 3 times before you actually collect the semen, you can more than double the number of sperm that you capture in the test tube when you make that collection. Just those few false mounts. make a huge difference in the success. Now, just a comment on the nose ring. It's not cruel, and I'll explain the nose ring in a second. Now, it's really important that the animal be under control. Okay, so you can see that you got one person out here who has the animal with the hook on that nose ring, and then you have the person whose job here is don't get crushed, get the sample, and then get out of the way. So the guy collecting the semen sample is typically wearing appropriate footwear. It's a really painful thing to get stepped on by these guys when they mount. Now, those of you who have any sort of work boots might have work boots that have that steel reinforced toe. Anybody ever seen that advertised steel? Do not wear steel reinforced toes when collecting semen from a bull, because when they land on your toe, they will pinch that thing right down into your foot, and you will now have no toes left on the end of your foot. What they have on their shoes is a metal plate that comes up at like a 45-degree angle. So when the hoof comes down and hits the top of the foot, it slides off. It doesn't land on the toe. That's one thing to note. The other thing to mention, if you don't know about the artificial vagina, basically it's a radiator, a piece of radiator hose that then has a vinyl liner, a rubber liner really. Between the radiator hose and the rubber liner is a column of warm water, and then it's well lubricated at the end of this tube. This artificial vagina is a little rubber funnel, and then a test tube at the bottom of that. And as soon as the glans penis of the animal hits that warm, moist artificial vagina, the animals ejaculate almost immediately. The nose ring. So as young calves, these nose rings are placed in them, and the animals are trained that it's just like when if you've done any dog training with a correction collar, you know that the purpose of that thing is not to drag the animal by its neck. The purpose of that collar is to give them a correction, snap and release. That says, ooh, that's unpleasant, but if I do what I'm supposed to do, it won't happen anymore. That's how the nose ring works. From the time they're a calf, a little snap of the nose gets them to like settle down. Okay, so when they're 200 pounds, it works really well. So that when they're 2,000 pounds, that same little snap, which doesn't hurt a 2,000-pound animal, but they learned that snap is unpleasant and they don't like that snap, and you can mostly control these animals reasonably well. Nevertheless, these facilities are built with double fencing everywhere around the perimeter at such a height that the human, like if an animal breaks loose, and I've seen an animal, for example, that tore its nose ring out. That was a scary looking animal that doesn't have the cover to the nose. And the guys, they set off the alarms, and it's mostly guys, and the guys go jumping over the fences to get out of that pen until they can find a way to now corral this animal into a place where they can get control of them, because they're going to have trouble, because these are animals that are going to interact with you in a way that's going to hurt you. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, and one that takes a lot of experience and a lot of care, and it works. And I'll get to your question in just a second. And what we've learned, I just want to say as a footnote, what we've learned from all of these years of work of trying to get this quality ejaculate out of these bulls, we could use to help subfertile humans. But alas, who's going to med school in here? Please remember today's lecture. If you decide to study urology and you end up in a fertility clinic or something, and you're dealing with how to get a good quality semen sample from your patients, learn from what we know about the animals in terms of what does arousal do for the quality of that ejaculate, because arousal will put more sperm into that ejaculate. And that's typically what's not done. You need a semen sample, they put you in a little lab room, fluorescent lights, cheesy porn or whatever it is. That's not the way to get a good sample. Doctors, MDs, please read the animal literature on this particular topic. There's really useful information there. Yes, ma'am?
I was just going to ask, is that the only way to handle the bull, using a harness or anything?
Question was, is that the only way to handle our bull, or are there other kinds of harness? There are other approaches. This is, so a lot of times we do things by tradition because that's kind of how we've always done it, and it's worked. And so the efforts to change things that are working probably haven't had the kind of attention that one could argue, you know, there might be a more humane way, but this doesn't seem to be bothering the animals and it works pretty well. So I think the answer to that question is yes, but we probably don't know as much as we ought to. If somebody cared and wanted to study it, I would imagine someone who understood behavior and who put their mind to it could probably come up with some interesting alternatives. Now, one of the approaches to that, for example, is maybe we shouldn't be hand feeding them. Because when you hand feed them, you're a youngster and you get your milk or your food from this two-legged thing, in a way, that's mama, that's part of the group. And so now when I interact with you socially, I'm going to behave as I do, which is, you know, butt you with my head, because that's how we communicate with one another. Maybe we need to give them this period of time with other cattle and not be the ones who feed them, so that now they view us in a different, sort of a little more standoffish way. And then maybe we don't have to be quite so in their face to prevent ourselves from being injured. So I think people just have to care enough to think about that and then do the work that gets at the answer. So, so I was telling you, look at the background and you see the animals who were in that waiting pen and paying attention to what was going on there. So, you know, the great thing about science is observation and paying attention to what's going around. And sometimes when you're studying one thing, you notice something else. So we were doing all this work in California to try to understand how to measure performance of bulls. And one of the things that we noticed is you had a test arena where the females were located, where the animals were brought in to be tested. And next to that area was a pen that was holding the animals that were going to be tested next. Well, what we were studying was what was going on inside here, but what we noticed was the guys over here were paying a lot of attention to what was happening. In fact, they wanted to get in. And then we were done with the guys in here and took them out over here and then went to open up the pen. It was like you had to fight off who wanted to come in next. So that said something to us about whether they're paying attention to what's going on, and if they're paying attention to what's going on, does that matter in terms of what we're measuring in that behavior test? We said, well, let's design a study. So we designed a whole bunch of studies in this area. And because we like to do some comparative work within related species of domesticates, we did this very similar sort of study in 3 different species. So let me describe essentially what we did and then take you through the data. So the idea here is, the question was, does watching sex change your sexual performance? I'm sort of boiling it down to its simplest terms. It's like, you know, does porn work for animals kind of thing. So the way the study was designed were animals were given the opportunity to mate in a test with females, and there was a stop clock, and we counted all the things that they did during that period of time. And animals were tested more than once, and one of the times that they were tested, they just came from their home pen and were put right into the test pen, and we measured their sexual behavior. And the treatment, quote unquote, the treatment was, before we actually tested them, we gave them a chance to watch another bull performing, another male perform. So they had this chance to lean through the fence to see what's going on and then come in and be tested themselves, okay? So that was sort of that visual stimulation before being tested themselves. So non-stimulated, just come right from the home pen and be measured, stimulated, have a chance to watch other males mating, and then be tested. So now this is, what are we measuring here? Is this ejaculations in a 15-minute period. So for bulls, you can see almost a doubling in the same period of time, almost a doubling in their frequency of ejaculation. Why did that happen? The bulls came in aroused when they saw what was going on. They ran over the females, they mounted, and they ejaculated right away. Then in a few seconds, they sort of had that post-ejaculatory refractory period. They recover from that in fairly short order, and then they start up again. As opposed to the bulls that had not been stimulated, and they come in and they kind of check out what's going on, sniff at the female. Takes them a little bit before they actually get aroused enough to start mounting and mating. So seeing mating changed their behavior. That works in bulls. Closely related species in goats. So we did that study in goats. Same sort of a finding. If you give the bucks a chance to see what's going on, we increase their performance. Clear idea? Simple enough? Good. Don't compare numbers across species. That doesn't make any sense to compare. We're only comparing within a species non-stimulated versus stimulated. Now look at what happened when we did the sheep. No change. No change. Whoa, what's going on here? Why aren't the rams like the bulls and the bucks? So my advisor and I, we'd have lunch together every day, and we'd kind of chew over these ideas. And we started reading the literature on what feral animals of these species act like in the feral setting. And it turns out there's some very interesting difference between and among these three species. So let me describe the sort of social life, if you will, of bulls and goats, because they're similar in this respect. In fact, in some ways, all three of them are similar. So this is what if you could go to islands where these animals had been released and you're looking at feral animals of these species, what you see is the following. The females in these groups, big groups of females. And often what you see within the groups of females are multi-generational maternal lines, right? Grandmother, daughter, granddaughter in clusters, and near that another set of grandmother, mother, daughter. That's pretty common across ungulates. We see that. You can see that in your backyard with the deer in New Jersey here. I watch this herd of deer in my backyard. I'm starting to recognize individuals, and I know who the grandmother is, who the mother is, and who the newborns are, because they're always together and they have characteristics that I can recognize. So it's very common, these female groups, and they hang out. The males, young males, when they reach puberty and you get to that first breeding season, the big old male comes in and says, get lost, chases off all the young males. So you have these groups of females, and then you have the males that do the breeding. And typically, when it's not the breeding season, the females are together, and the males, if you're a mature old male, you're off by yourself somewhere, because you can't tolerate the presence of anyone until the breeding season comes along. If you're a young male, you guys are hanging out in groups. They're called bachelor groups. You know, what do bachelor groups do? You know, they fight with each other, they have sex with each other. It's all good stuff. But they're away from the females. Now the breeding season comes along, and females start to come into estrus. This is where things change. If you're a cow, or if you're a doe, a goat, and you come into estrus, what do? All of a sudden, you start getting frisky. And you get frisky with other females that are coming into estrus too. And the females start to mount each other. And there's all this frenzy of sexual activity among the females there. Now you're the male and you're off at the side, and it's like you notice this activity. It's like, hey, what's going on down there? So you come into the group and now you mate the females. So from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense to pay attention to what's going on over there, because you don't want to miss that opportunity. You see females mounting each other, it's your turn to come in and take over, right? Pretty clear. What about the sheep? Females are together, the breeding season comes, now they come in estrus. They don't mount each other. You know what they do? They leave that group and they go a-hunting. And what are they hunting? They're hunting ram, right? The females look for the rams. The rams don't come to the females go to the rams. In fact, the literature has known this for years and years and years. It's called ram-seeking behavior. You don't have that in cattle and does. They don't have to seek. They mount each other and the males seek out the females. But in rams, the females seek out the males. So now you think about this study, and maybe that's an explanation. Here's two species that have evolved to be attentive to what's going on when there's sexual activity happening. They were watching the mating. These guys, they don't Evolution was not operating on them to pay attention to what's out there. Evolution's operating on them in some other ways, some other traits. The females will find them. Maybe they're doing something that draws the females' attentions to them. So in fact, they're not prepared in a way to pay attention to what was happening in the pen. So now let me tell you what we saw. When we were running these tests, because I described to you, over here's the holding pen for the guys to be tested. And here's the place where the testing is happening. The bulls and the bucks, if this is like the fence, they're up against the fence. They're fighting each other. They're mounting each other. Their heads coming through. They're trying to push through the fence to get in. They want. The rams, they're off at the corners, nibbling on grass over here, paying attention, not even paying attention to what was happening. Even though we tried to, quote, stimulate them by giving them the opportunity to watch, they didn't pay attention. It wasn't relevant to the selection pressures that are operating on them. What's relevant to them must be something else. So it's interesting when we look, we have these domesticated species and lots of changes have taken place, but maybe there's good explanations for these observations even thousands of years after domestication. My clicker went to sleep. So when you come to visit me in my office, you'll see a huge mural on my wall. That is this painting right here. And this summarizes the lecture that I just said. Here's the bull looking down here, and you can see the little chin resting behavior. Here's the females interacting with each other. And the bull's going to pay attention to what's going on down there. And this thing covers one whole wall in my office. Now, if you also know from animal science that I'm interested in the domestication of animals, and the picture cut it off a little bit. See the cloud? You can just kind of make out what's happening. See the head of a cattle? Here's the muzzle. Here's an eye. Yeah, here's the body, the legs. Right? Now, the top of the picture's cut off. It's got horns. When cattle were first domesticated, they were viewed as the earthly presence of the moon god. And so I had this painting done so that the horns on the cow, that's actually this cloud formation, looks like a crescent moon in the sky. So come visit me and see the painting. There's no admission fee. I don't know why this is asleep. So it had us scratching heads and other parts to try to figure out what's going on with sheep. Can we do anything that they might pay attention to that would make sense in terms of sexual arousal for the sheep? So I had a graduate student, and we sort of followed in the footsteps of what I did with my advisor, as we would have lunch together and we would hash out these ideas. And we said, what if we paid attention to what these rams are paying attention to and designed this study? So what we noticed was, remember I said the rams were off here not really paying attention to what was going on in the test pen. But what we did notice is when we took the ram who was just tested, and now he's been with the female, and we took him out of that pen and we put him back with his buddies circled him and sniffed him up and down and wanted to know, where you been? Where you been? We said, so let's design a study where we take a ram away from his buddies, we give him some kind of experience, a variety of different kinds of experience, put him back with his buddies, and then test the sexual behavior of his buddies. In other words, can the ram tell his other buddies that maybe something interesting just happened? So that's what this study, these results are showing, and I'll just tell you the abbreviations describe the conditions that the male who was taken away was exposed to. So for example, you had to have a control, so the animal was put into an empty pen. So we took the male out, we put him in an empty pen, we waited 5 minutes, and we took him and we put him back with his buddies. Okay? And then we started to test his buddies. Or we took the male out and we put him in a pen, and there was another male present in that pen. We gave him the 5 minutes, we took him out, and we put him in with his buddies. Or We took him out and we put him in a pen. There was a female in there, but she was not in estrus. 5 minutes, put him through the test. Or we put him in a test and there was a female in estrus, and the subtext here, NM, no mounting took place. So we put the male, so what happened was sometimes we put the male in there with the females in estrus and they mounted, sometimes they didn't. So to kind of control for whether or not we mounted, we just sort of were lucky enough where we did this enough times so that we had replicates of being placed with the female and mounting took place, or being placed with the male and no mounting took place. So E, no mount, E, mounting took place. Now, we wanted to control for whether or not the male actually mated the female. So we created a chastity belt. And the chastity belt was a little piece of cloth with some adhesive on it, and we put it over the vagina of the females that they were in. So they could mount, but they couldn't ejaculate. Now, so then in the final test, what we did is we placed them with a female that was not wearing one of these chastity belts. So now mating, so now complete mating could take place. So what this bar is showing is the frequency of sexual behaviors that took place in a short period of time after being exposed to a pen mate who had these different kinds of experiences. And what we found was that if your buddy was with an estrus female and he mounted that estrus female, you were aroused. So our hypothesis was there's some scent. We figured they didn't have a conversation in the sense that we think of a conversation, but maybe they had an olfactory conversation. The male came back carrying some sort of scent of that female that was in estrus. But interestingly, these males, while they were with a female that was in estrus, they didn't mount them. And what we had noticed was that when the males checked out their buddies, they were checking out the underside. They were checking out around the penis of the buddies that come back. So they were going right for where they think, right where that signal might have been. And if that penis had been on top of a female, that sexually aroused another male. So here we had communication among the males about breeding opportunities that led to an enhancement of their sexual excitement. Pretty neat idea, because if you go back to this social context and you have the males out by themselves and they're in groups together, and let's say females, and we come to the breeding season and females go out and they're sort of spread over large areas, and now the female mates with another male, and then that male rejoins the bachelor group, and that male is coming back and he's carrying signals, he's carrying odors from a female, that might be a relevant signal for these males to know. Be on the alert for females who are seeking me out. Be ready to mate if a female appears, because you know the season's upon us. The females have already been present. So different species, evolving under different circumstances, different environments, are going to respond to social cues in very different ways. Very complex system, requires teasing things apart. The great thing about studying behavior in a domesticated animal is you can do these kinds of studies, these highly controlled studies, which would be impossible to do with wild animals. I'm not putting down, obviously, behavior studies in wild animals. I'm just saying that, you know, when some people say, well, you know, why are you studying this in a domesticated animal? It's not a real animal anymore. It's clearly a real animal that responds to its social environment, and it can tell us something about the evolutionary history of that animal. Okay, time is up. I'm going to pick it up from next slide. On Thursday, we'll finish the male and start the female. And thank you very much. So here's where we left off, and complicated experimental design, but my point was to try to get across to you that when we're trying to understand some of the results of our studies of animal behavior, we need to put the results in the context of the social life of the animal that we're studying. In other words, there's a socio-ecological explanation often for the kinds of responses that we see in our various species. Animals, based on their evolutionary history as well as the selection pressures that humans have put on them, are sort of prepared to learn certain things, to behave in certain ways. And so we need to always think about the observations of these behaviors in a real context, because we're dealing with animals that are constantly in connection with, in communication with their external environment, the social environment, the physical environment, and then the internal events that change their motivation or their likelihood to behave. And we're going to talk about that a little bit now as we proceed. Questions? Okay, so I want to tell you about another study that we did here that revealed some rather interesting observations. And it makes a certain amount of sense when, again, we sort of apply an evolutionary perspective. So this is the outcome, one graph, representing well over a year's worth of work of one of my former students. And what we're looking at here, just to kind of take you through the graph, and then I'll explain in more detail. On the y-axis is the mean serum testosterone concentrations. You know what testosterone is, so animals had blood samples drawn from them once a week for a 1 year period. Once every 2 weeks for a 1 year period. So you see the x-axis now starts out here at the end of summer, and on this particular graph it runs out here to the beginning of the springtime. And so testosterone concentrations are shown on the y-axis, and now you have two lines. And what you see on these lines, first of all, are the open circles and the closed circles. The closed circles represent a population of animals, and you see from the guide that we called near bucks. And by near bucks, what we mean is they lived in a yard where there were females on the other side of the fence. So they were near females. In the open circles are the animals that we call the far bucks. They lived in a yard where there was no females in view of them. They were still on our farm, so one can argue that, well, there's still the odor of female goats in the air, but these males could not see them, could not interact with them across the fence line. So that's the only difference between these two groups. So let's just look, for example, at what happens when you're housed near females and the breeding season begins, to your testosterone levels. So we're out here in the summertime, and not surprisingly, testosterone levels are low. And then as the photo period commences, that is, as the days get shorter, you see this sharp increase in testosterone. And through the course of the breeding season, you see testosterone levels remain elevated, and then, not surprisingly, as you get out here towards the fall and the winter, they start to drop off, so that by the end of the winter, testosterone levels are low. That's the typical pattern profile of testosterone for males that are short breeders, that is, breed during the fall, during the days of short photo period. Now look at the difference between the two bars here, especially in this period of time between these two dashed lines. So the first set of dashed lines represents when we actually moved animals either to the near or to the far condition. In other words, we divided the animals up into two groups here at the end of August, and now they became either near or far. And then we made a change in the housing at this second line. And what we did is, in the middle of October, we took the near guys and we moved them into the pen with the far guys. In other words, we put them in the pen where they were now next to females. And what we saw happening was, in a very short order of time, their testosterone levels increased. It shot up. They didn't stay up for very long because we did this kind of near the end of the season, and then they fell back down as they would. But what happened when we put them here was they started to interact with the females across the fence line, and their testosterone levels increased. So even when they were not near females, you still had the seasonal increase in testosterone, but it didn't go up as high as it did for the males that were near females. You see the difference? This part clear? So one wonders, so what's going on here? You have the seasonal effects of changing their endocrinology, and when you study reproductive physiology, it's very clear that seasonal breeders go through these kinds of changes. But why the difference when there are females present or not females present? Well, one can make lots of arguments, and one of the important things to look at is what else is going on when testosterone levels increase. By the way, just to convince you that there were real differences between these two groups. We just sort of summed across all the testosterone concentrations for all those separate samples, and here you can see the average, what's known as the area under the curve. You remember calculus, you can do these various ways to calculate areas under a complex curve, and what we see is if you're far from females, you have lower testosterone than if you're near females. So this is just sort of re-summarizing, restating the data I showed you before. Then we moved the animals. So here, if we take a look at the animals who were far, here's that lower testosterone compared to the near bucks, and then we moved them. And this is what happened to their testosterone when we moved them. So I just want to convince you that this was a real effect. There's a difference between the near and far, and then this difference went away when we moved these guys who had been away from females close to females. Okay? That part, I think, is clear. What else is going on when testosterone levels increase? So we were taking body weight measures of these animals because we've known for many years that as males enter the breeding season, there are not just the increase in testosterone concentrations, but their activity level increases. Typically, they eat less. And as it turns out, they lose a lot of weight. In fact, they get quite frail. They put themselves at quite some health risk during this breeding season. In other words, there's a cost to being ready to breed. One could argue, well, that's from an evolutionary perspective, that's fine because there's a benefit to being ready to breed, right? You might be the sire of many offspring if you're ready to breed. And so let's just take a look. This is just repeating the same data that you looked at before. The upper panel is here. You're kind of seeing, compressed though, the difference between the bucks who are near and the bucks who are far. But look at the body weight changes over this period of time. Look what happens to the body weight of these guys who were near females, who had elevated testosterone concentrations. They just disappeared. I mean, they wasted away. They're fighting each other. They're not eating as often. They're trying to court the females through the fence line. This is one way to measure the cost of this reproductive strategy. So yeah, it makes sense to be reproductively active, but it has some cost. So now, in thinking about the difference between these two groups, one can say, well, here's an interesting reproductive strategy. So the breeding season, the change in the photoperiod, drives this increase in your reproductive axis. So your pulse frequency of GnRH increases, LH pulsatility increases, and testosterone output increases. But it's not going to, it's going to increase to the point where you might be reproductively capable, but it's not going to go sort of into high gear. It's not going to go into that most extreme case if there's no opportunity for breeding. There were no females around. And so what happens is these animals, while they have an elevation of testosterone, they don't have as much body weight loss as these animals. So in a sense, what is happening to the animal is if there's an opportunity to breed, the system can get ramped up, and when the system gets ramped up, you potentially get your breeding done, but it also costs you a great deal. When you look at many animals like goats, various antelopes and other animals in the wild, the death rate of males is very, very high during the breeding, typically not in the non-breeding season, but by the end of the breeding season. Animals sort of burn themselves out during this breeding season. Well, one would argue, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for survival, but it does make a whole lot of sense when you realize that what they're doing to burn themselves out is making sure that they're putting their sperm in as many females as possible. Okay? And the ultimate measure of success from an evolutionary perspective is how many offspring do you leave behind. So it's a strategy, a mating strategy that allows the environmental conditions, the presence or absence of females in this case, coupled with the changing photoperiod to influence how these animals change their physiology. Yes?
Before the
Sam.
study, were the far bucks ever around females?
Yes, these were all sexually experienced males that had been with females in the past. So, yep. We balanced them for age and body weight and as you would expect in a well-designed study. So, one question that this study raised in our mind was, is the increase in testosterone causing the change in body weight? Or is there something else going on and just the change in body weight and photoperiod correlations? So one of the ways that you try to get at whether there's a cause to two changes that are happening at the same time is you can manipulate the system in such a way to see that if we artificially manipulate testosterone concentrations, can we bring about the same sorts of changes that we would have seen in the, for example, far and near conditions. So what we did for this study is we used a group of castrated males and then we treated them with different doses of testosterone. And we looked at body weight. Does the testosterone itself cause the predictable changes in body weight that we saw when testosterone increased based on their proximity to females? So here's again a graph showing body weight on the y-axis, and then when we started treating these castrated animals. The open bars are controls. They just receive an injection of the oil substrate, the vehicle that the testosterone is dissolved in. Okay, the gray bars get a dose of 25 milligrams 3 times a week, and the black bars represent 100 milligrams 3 times a week. And this particular dose, 100 milligrams 3 times a week, brings their testosterone concentrations close to the levels that we see in animals that are living near females. And so then we began the treatments. Here you can see in July-August period. So it starts out with body weights pretty much the same among the 3 groups of castrated males. And then once we start our testosterone treatments, just for the moment, just look at the high dose of testosterone and compare it to the controls. So you see the controls stay pretty steady, a little bit of increase by June because in the springtime they're eating a lot. But look at these guys on testosterone. You just see this dramatic drop off in their body weight. So the only thing that happened here is they were treated with different doses of testosterone. From this study, we can conclude that it was that increase in testosterone that caused that decrease in body weight. Now this is kind of interesting because there are lots of studies of animals in the wild, natural settings, where we see all sorts of other kinds of problems with animals that have elevated testosterone. When breeding conditions come into place, we see increased death, increased disease, increased amount of body weight loss. We see higher parasitism in these animals. Reproduction costs. And so this is a sort of nice controlled study that shows one way of measuring that cost. And also bear in mind that it costs, but the animals have evolved a strategy to not take on that high cost if there's no opportunity to breed. No females around, testosterone levels don't go up as high. Your body weight loss is also not as great.
So the males treated with the 100 milligrams, were they showing behavior as if females?
Oh yeah, they were obnoxious, they were fighting, they were self-urinating, they were doing all the things we see in bucks near females. Yep, good question. This is without females being present. Yes. Yes?
What was the evolved strategy again that they adopted?
So the strategy is be prepared to reproduce. So photoperiod changes, you're prepared to reproduce. These animals are fertile at this point. But you don't max out the system if there's no opportunity to breed. So it's basically a strategy of sort of you're kind of humming along here, and then if females are present, you then take it to the next level. Okay, but you don't put yourself at that same level of risk if there's no breeding opportunity. So, that's a little bit of physiology. Let's talk a little bit of sort of management and from a practical perspective. We know that because of this relaxation of natural selection that I talked about earlier, that there are some males in our domesticated herds that show a low sexual performance. They're not getting females bred quickly when the breeding season begins. And what we wanted to do was, and what we still want to do, is try to identify these animals who may represent, I sort of tongue-in-cheek called them the duds. Can we identify these duds and eliminate them from the breeding herd, try to reapply the selective pressure on sexual performance that has been removed by virtue of these single male or AI systems that allow animals with low sexual performance to reproduce anyway. And so many different labs across different parts of the world, from Mexico to New Zealand, Australia, the United States, some in France, have tried to get at this question is how do you measure the sexual performance in these animals? And part of the reason that was of interest was from looking at a broad range of studies, we determined that almost 10% of the cattle, the bulls, who were being used as breeders, showed subnormal sexual performance. And I'm going to show you some data in a minute that will drive home the point of how impactful that is. A slightly lower percentage, but nevertheless a significant percentage of the sheep, male rams, displayed inadequate sexual performance in these sexual performance tests that have been referred to as serving capacity tests. So in a serving capacity test, the idea here is you give a male an opportunity to mate with females, and you measure how frequently he does so. You measure his success. That's what we mean by the performance. Okay? And then from that information, we learn something about the animal. One of the interesting things that we discovered by running these serving capacity tests is that we found some other problems that one wouldn't be able to see when you were doing your normal vet check on these breeding animals. So you decide you have this group of bulls that you're going to use to breed your herd, and you call the veterinarian in. Some of you may become veterinarians, and if you're interested in large animal medicine, you'll learn about something called a breeding soundness exam. Breeding soundness exam is simply a medical checkup, a veterinary checkup of the animals to make sure that they are healthy and that they're fertile. And typically they come in, a standard routine exam is done. In some cases, a semen sample is collected. The semen is evaluated for its potential fertility. Basically, they're counting the number of sperm. They're counting the percentage of motile sperm in that sample. And then they're deeming that the animal may be useful for your breeding program. The problem is there are some conditions that males have for congenital reasons that are problems that are not detected in a breeding soundness exam. For example, there's a leg problem, sometimes called sickle hock, and you don't necessarily see it when the animal is just walking, but when they mount the female, because of the conformation of their hind legs, they fall backwards. And so they can't get the breeding done because they can't support their own weight on their hind legs. And you won't see that unless you're actually watching them mating. So these serving capacity tests or sexual performance tests allow you to see whether this animal has this physical debilitation that you want to then, that's a criterion for eliminating this animal from your breeding herd. The other interesting condition that's found is known as corkscrew penis. So you all know what a corkscrew looks like, right? It has that sort of S-twisting shape like a screw, threaded screw. So as it turns out, what was learned in the early 60s actually from some high-speed photography using glass, artificial vaginas, was that at the moment of ejaculation, the glans penis of the bull twists itself into a corkscrew. And it does it very rapidly, and then it uncoils again. And so what was seen in this high-speed photography was that at the time of ejaculation, when that twisting takes place, that twisting actually imparts a forward velocity to the sperm. So in a sense, the animal wasn't just ejaculating, but it was sort of catapulting the sperm forward into the reproductive tract of the female. And the anatomists, the neuroanatomists at the time, when they saw that video, they said, that can't be. The musculature of the penis doesn't make sense. The anatomists went back and they looked at the smooth muscles of the penis and they said, holy cow, we never noticed this before. But in fact, the smooth muscles around the glans penis of the bull are radially arranged. And it was something that had been missed. And it was actually the study of behavior of this event, ejaculation, that led to that anatomical discovery. So my point of telling you that story is there's a condition where some males, as soon as they have an erection, the glans penis becomes corkscrew shaped. You can't mate when you have that corkscrew penis. Intromission is just not possible. They need to intromit with the straight penis, and then the corkscrew happens later. And the only way this would be identified is if you do the serving capacity test and see what happens. And it's a fair percentage of the males actually that have this condition that need to be culled. Now you may think it's funny or it's trivial. In some of these operations, people are spending $150,000, $250,000, $300,000, $500,000 for a bull. Yes, $500,000 for one animal. So think how you'd feel if you've just spent $500,000 on this animal and you find out he can't even get your herd bred. Okay? This is an important problem. So a lot of things that can be discovered by running these serving capacity tests, and in some places they're being used quite widely. So I'm going to be, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through a couple slides because they're in your PowerPoint. You can read them. I think they're self-evident. I do want to get to some data that will convince you that it is important, that it has some real practical and economic value. But let me tell you why. Let me now show you what we learned from running serving capacity tests. So these are data from a large study that was done in Australia quite a few years ago. And what they had done was taken a group of bulls, they had put them through these serving capacity or sexual performance tests, and then they categorized them based on their performance in those tests as either being low serving, medium serving, or high serving capacity bulls. The number in parentheses are the number of ejaculations they achieved in, I think it was a 40-minute test. Doesn't matter. For our purposes here, it doesn't matter how long the test was. It just matters that there were differences in the performance of animals, and they were categorized in this way. Once they were categorized, they were then put out in pasture, and they were assigned a group of cows. So each bull was in a pasture, and it had a large group of cows. And then what was done was 3 weeks after they were placed with the bulls, after the cows and bulls were put together, a pregnancy check was done. Why need to understand why 3 weeks. What's special about 3 weeks? How many days is 3 weeks? What's the length of the estrus cycle for a cow? So at the end of 21 days, in theory, every cow should have ovulated once. Okay, so now they come in and they do the pregnancy check. Not surprisingly, these guys who were categorized as low serving capacity only got 21% of the females pregnant. The medium got 60%, and the high got 73%. Then at the end of the breeding season, 10 weeks, at the end of the 10 weeks, they come in and they do the pregnancy check again, and you can still see, man, you want to get rid of these guys. They're only breeding a third of your herd. These guys, okay, they're doing okay, 92%. Maybe you could say the mediums are almost as good as the highs, and the highs are pretty much getting, any that didn't get pregnant here probably had fertility problems on the female side, rather than the fact the bull not actually mounting them. Okay, so why does this make a difference? At the end of the breeding season, most everybody's pregnant anyway, except you have to understand how people sell their calves. So you have your breeding season, you pull the bulls out, you leave the cows alone, they develop, the fetus develops, they deliver the calf, they're out on pasture, calf's drinking mom's milk, and at the time of weaning, everyone is sold. Okay, so you don't sell them by dribs and drabs, you load it, you round up the whole herd wherever you happen to be, you sell all the calves at the same time. Well, you can imagine that if these bulls inseminated the females earlier in the breeding season than these bulls, then the calves from these bulls are going to be older than the calves from here. If you don't get the cow bred the first time she comes into estrus, but you get her bred the second time she comes into estrus, that calf, at the time you sell it, is 21 days younger or older. Because I forget how I started the sentence, right? That clear? So let's look at the economics. So, average rate of gain for a calf on a mother out on pasture, calf is drinking milk, mom's out on pasture, is about 2.5 pounds per day. Okay, that 21 days, so let's say one estrus cycle, so 21 days later, and on today's market prices, feeder calves are selling for $1.34 per pound. And so now you have a loss of over $70 for each of those calves who may be 21 days younger than a calf whose mom was bred by that bull one day earlier. Extend that out to like another 21 days later, or even another 21 days later, and you can see the economic cost. Let's say, take this $70 per calf and say you have a 1,000 cow herd, and maybe you have 80% calf rate, so you've got 800 calves times $70 per calf difference. You're going to sit up and take notice to the economic impact of what the bull can do to the production of your herd. Okay, these are numbers that matter to anybody who's trying to make a living. This can make the difference between being profitable and not being profitable in your operation. So it's really important to understand something about these bulls, to know how we measure performance and be able to use that data. Now, as it turns out, for cattle, it's really a great test. So we know from lots of years of studies that when we run these sexual performance tests, on the operations, that these data are going to apply pretty closely to what might happen out in the field. In other words, a high serving capacity bull is probably going to get the cows bred sooner. The data for sheep is a little less reliable. Some of that has to do with the age of the ram and the sexual experience of that ram. So we're still trying to figure out better ways to get the sense of what the ram's going to do. And the goat data, we just don't know yet. So there's lots of questions, things for you guys to do if you decide to go to grad school. Maybe part of what we need to do is understand a little bit about how we might be able to measure the motivation of animals rather than just the performance of animals, because sometimes that performance can vary from test to test. There are a lot of intervening variables that can influence how they do on one or two or three performance tests. So we're trying to get an idea of, can we remember on Tuesday I talked about libido. Can we actually measure the motivation of these animals? And we and some other groups have been trying to do this for some time. We're not sure we have the answer yet, but we'll keep working at it. So part of the issue is why the reliability of these tests is sometimes questionable, is that the tests are sometimes done on very young animals, and while the young animal might show one level of motivation, when they reach mature age, their performance might be different. Perhaps they got too heavy, perhaps there were some injuries. There may be other physical factors that influence our ability to get a good estimate of their worthiness in breeding programs. And we certainly know that we have to have experienced animals, that you want to give them some experience before you run this test. Just to give you an idea of how some of the breeders believed in the value of this serving capacity test. When we were traveling the full length of the state of California in the Central Valley, where there's a lot of beef cattle operations, and the breeders there would call us in to run these serving capacity tests. We had operators there who actually took the bull. If the bull performed poorly in the sexual performance test, they actually put them right onto the truck and sent them to market. On the day we ran the test, they said, I'm not going to continue feeding an animal that I'm not going to be able to sell as a high serving capacity bull. And so when they were selling those bulls, they were selling them not only giving the genetic information about the various traits of interest, like the growth rate of their offspring, which is what these producers are looking at, but they were saying something about, you're going to be buying a bull that's going to get your cows bred sooner. So there was a lot of trust in us for a while in getting these studies done, which allowed us to collect a lot of data. Thousands and thousands of animals we were able to collect this data on. Okay, so just a couple comments before we wrap up the male and move on to the female. So because we're trying to get at what the mature animal is going to do when placed with adult females, we have to recognize that there are several things that are taking place in the development of this animal. And not all aspects of animal development follows the same trajectory. In other words, the timeline of development of different traits can vary. And so ontogeny is a word that refers to development of the individual. And what we know for the development of the individual is that there's one rate expectation for physical maturation, which for some of these species, especially the animals where sexual selection has been operating on these males to compete against one another in order to get to that full size and that large size of a dominant male, it can take a long time. For some, it could be 3 years, 5 years. Often they're used in breeding programs much earlier than that. even before they've reached that full physical maturation. But the brain probably develops a whole lot faster in these animals. And we know, for example, that the sexual performance and the sexual drive of these young animals can develop at a very early age. So here's sort of a collage of some pictures that is just for fun, really, to show you. These are calves. These are not even weaned yet. And you can see they start this mounting behavior. And here you see a calf is mounting it could be his mother, or it could be some other, another member of the cow. And you see the size difference makes mating impossible there. And here, remember I talked to you about the orientation, mounting orientation? If you look at this one, you see the head under here, and the bull calf is mounting head first. So you see a lot of that. Now, an interesting question arises is this sex or is this play? And I don't know the answer to that. It's sex play, but does this behavior influence the later development of this animal's full complement of sexual behaviors? That's an important developmental question that still needs the right questions, the right experiments designed to get at that. This one I put in here, again, just to remind myself of this great vacation I had in Ireland. So we're on vacation, and we have a rental car, and we're driving around Ireland, and sheep are still out on the commons. In other words, they're just out there grazing wherever they happen to be. And we were there in the springtime, and we're driving along, and I see this. Now, these are two lambs. And I slam on the brakes, I hang out of the window of the car, and I was able to capture the picture of this happening. These are young animals. So when you're trying to understand behavior, and a behavior as complex as sexual behavior, you have to think about the developmental trajectories, physical trajectories and mental trajectories as well. So as a summary, I would make sure and ask you to be able to understand the difference between this idea of libido and sexual motivation or sex drive, the mental state, which is not impossible to measure, but it's difficult to measure, because how do you know what's going on in the head? Versus what we typically do, sort of the pragmatic approach. We may not be able to understand what motivates the animal, but we can certainly see what they do when given the opportunity, and that's what we mean by sexual performance. And I don't like to confuse those two ideas, because in my mind they're related, but they're very different. Okay? So one can have very high libido and low sexual performance, but you're likely not to have a very high sexual performance unless one has a high sexual motivation. Okay, so do you see the cognitive difference versus the physical difference? So from a practical perspective, what we're interested in is, can the males get the females bred? And so sexual performance then is the summation of both the psychological and the physical factors.